Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here today. I'm talking about the thing that he just said I'm talking about. So a little bit about me. I'm an audio and narrative producer externally. I've been doing this for about 4 years now, going on 4 years. And I'm here to talk about some experience I've had supporting cultural consultants, specifically in dialogue. Obviously, cultural consultants have been utilized. There's been a lot of discussion about using them in narrative and art, but there's ways that they are helpful to audio teams as well. And I think that because dialogue is necessarily the intersection of both narrative and audio, it's helpful that we audio people know what our narrative folks are also doing, and potentially how these consultants are helping us as well. So a couple of projects that I've worked with consultants on is the video game Wildflowers. I've worked with the Sims team with cultural consultants, as well as the Valorant Voices team. And I hope that our talk here today can provide you a few examples that inspire you to think about how you might work with cultural consultants in your work. So a lot of people, when they start off, they're thinking about, when do I need a cultural consultant? Is it just because it's something that I don't know? Is it, when do I bring them in? How do I work with them? I think an important reframing to this question is actually, how can a cultural consultant help? And I want to touch on 3 key words that I think kind of sum up, in my opinion, some ways that cultural consultants can support teams. Obviously, we can bring in experts to help with our research, covering the basics beyond the Wikipedia pages, and getting into some of the more nitty-gritty details. They can provide us with clarity, being sort of discernment of different opinions about specific details, navigating some of the, as people in society, we have narratives that sometimes obfuscate our views about other subjects. And cultural consultants can provide us with clarity, kind of dispelling some of that obfuscation or confusion. Additionally, they can provide us with a lot of confidence and create a more collaborative environment where we can feel really confident in our choices, both bold and very minute, that can create novel and engaging experiences for our players. So, as a producer, I have to jump in and say, there are some, realistic factors that we as people deal with, those being budget, timeline, and scope. Those are always going to be different, and that's obviously going to color how you answer this question and, some of the ways that you can work with a cultural consultant. And I'm going to stop being a producer now and continue talking. So let's talk about audio specifically. I have supported teams with cultural consultants in the casting, pre-session, and in-session recording process. If we have time, I'll touch very briefly on some other audio things. A disclaimer before you get your pitchforks and torches out is that I will be touching on some narrative things. Please set them down. I apologize in advance. So let's talk about casting. The casting process is we're looking for talent that that usually we want to find authentic and sort of a best fit. When we're working with characters that go beyond our sort of knowledge base, cultural consultants can aid us in initially reviewing casting sides. Again, this is narrative. I'm sorry. We'll get to the audio, more specific audio stuff. But with casting sides, one example is that we received casting sides that were looking for a CU character who speaks CU. When looking this over, we realized that, well, CU is a super generic umbrella term that actually incorporates a diversity of different indigenous tribes and 2 different languages. So we're not being very specific with our casting materials. And so after a bit of consultation, we realized, well, what we are really looking for is someone who is Lakota, who speaks Lakota. The CU term also is an exonym. It was given to them by someone else and translates roughly to enemy, which maybe is not what we want to be sending out to the talent that is potentially Lakota and might take offense to that. So this is one way in which cultural consultants can help us navigate certain things that we are not knowledgeable about, but other people are experts about, especially our players. So when auditioning, especially for characters with different accents or languages that we are not familiar with, there's going to be a lot of information that players will receive from those voices, whether it's about their caste, whether it's about where they live, urban, rural. Do they live in an island within a nation that then has a different dialect? as part of the audition process, cultural consultants, especially those linguists out there or translators, can create little hurdles. I've seen different teams do this, where they create specific hurdles in the audition lines process that then force the actors to really show that they know how to portray those authentic things. This also helps prevent people from just faking their way through an audition. And as well, they can provide a review of submissions at the end that can really get into depth of, yes, this person sounds Norwegian, and they sound specifically like they're from the north of Norway, not Oslo. We're looking for a character from Oslo, so we don't want to cast that person. They might sound Norwegian in general, but a player from Norway or who has that knowledge will say, that's not an Oslo accent. So those are the sort of things that cultural consultants can provide in the casting stage to make sure we're hiring people from the jump that meet our authentic needs. Additionally, before session, cultural consultants can provide a bit of a review of those audition submissions or an audio sample from the talent, identifying some key areas that might need support. If they pronounce certain words a certain way, for example, even within the US, if you were hiring an actor from the South and they have some of that drawl that then just sometimes in that A just kind of comes out a little bit in the session, you want someone who can kind of keep track of that and make sure that in advance we're making sure that that's not going to disrupt the performance of our character. Additionally, slang is a huge thing. We want to portray slang authentically, but slang varies so much. Even within the US, there's people referring to soda, pop, and Coke. In France, I speak some French. There's verlan, which is a specific slang that is spoken by mostly young people, mostly from the suburbs. Now, though, if we're casting an older character, it wouldn't make sense for them to speak with that slang. Additionally, they can help us with balancing broad comprehension by our players and authenticity. One example of this is the character Clove for Valorant is Scottish and non-binary, and while a super authentic Scottish accent is really fun, that doesn't really help when you're in a 5v5 tac shooter and you need to understand the dialogue being spoken. Lastly, in session, cultural consultants such as dialect coaches can support the talent by providing them with inspiration for improv, as well as verifying that that improv, once again, aligns with what we want out of our characters. They can ensure that our accent and dialects are staying consistent, and they can even support the voice team itself, like voice directors. An example of this is that on Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, we had a lot of dialogue, and some of it was in English and other languages. A lot of it was in Spanish. We had one voice director out of a team that spoke both English and Spanish. So they were able to sort of provide direction in Spanish and English, but for those other directors that only spoke English, inevitably the schedules did not align, and we were recording Spanish with one of those directors. Our dialect coaches were able to provide some tips and sort of direction support on those Spanish-specific lines. Very briefly, an example of some other ways that I've seen cultural consultants used was that for, once again, the character Clove in Valorant, the team consulted with a non-binary Gen Z person to sort of talk about sort of musical trends that are present within that community. And with that sort of knowledge, they collaborated with the artist Madge to create a wholly original song to be released with the character to support the character's release. I'm sure that there's many other clever people who are smarter than me who can think of ways that cultural consultants might be able to support composition, sound design, Foley, and other ways even within dialogue. So I hope that this has helped inspire you to think about some ways that they can support you and feel some confidence in doing so. Thank you very much, and appreciate it. Can I take one or two questions? Yeah. All right, I can take one or two questions if anyone has any. Yeah.
You mentioned the Lakota anecdote.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a anecdote or moment where you really had a personal moment of realization about the value of it?
Yeah, specifically on that project, I was doing the Wikipedia page of research to understand what we were casting. And that's when I initially stumbled on that information, realizing that CU as a term can refer to both Lakota speakers and Dakota speakers, and the fact that I have no idea how to differentiate between those two, and most likely no one on the dev team could, meant that was sort of the spark to me that was like, oh, we could have ended up in a completely different place. And those people playing the game who see that representation of themselves, to then hear the wrong language being spoken, totally would have thrown things off, right? It would have reflected a lot on us as a casting team, but it also would have really reflected on the dev team, and kind of showing the work that wasn't done. Yeah.
Have you like met like an impasse where like the team is like let's say your higher ups are like, oh, we don't have the budget for getting a cultural consultant, and how did you like kind of go about it?
Yeah. So this question is about how has there been times where people higher up on the chain, or perhaps due to those realistic constraints I mentioned as a producer, have affected this sort of work? And I think the answer is that it always affects this work, and it affects all of our work. And unfortunately, as this is a relatively new thing within games, I think that it gets impacted even more, especially as audio people. We know that our sort of department tends to be a little bit less center than others. And even within that, then everything else kind of also gets deprioritized. And so I think it's important for us to advocate for why it's important. Not only do great tools make great games, as was mentioned earlier, but great people make great games. And people are an important part of that. Unfortunately, it won't always work out, just like every other plan that we come up with at the beginning of development won't always work out. But I think it's important to advocate for that. And I think talking about things like this is how we better advocate for those things, about what do they even do and what can they provide. Mm-hmm.